icon, which is quite good, and mockito.org will find you, and there's one blog in there which I'll put these slides up on. Okay, so basically mocking frameworks are useful when you've got some interaction testing that needs to be done. So there's state-based testing, which is the simple stuff where you just say, give me an object and check it's got the right value. And then we've got interaction testing, which is, did my controller correctly call the service? So you can imagine you've got a controller up there, and then it needs to delegate to the service to do some call, or likewise the service could be delegating to a DAO. And you want to try and work out whether it actually got called, and whether it got called with the right arguments, and whether it returns the right value, that sort of thing. So Mockito is a mocking framework for these interactions. Just to define a few different things, so we've all got the right terminology here. Jared Nazaros, he's got a book on basically unit testing patterns and such like. If you click on that URL, it actually takes you to an excerpt from it which has these definitions. And so a test stub is kind of what people used to write a lot of. And a test stub is basically you write a concrete implementation of the interface, and in it you also code the exact interactions you're expecting to happen. So it can be quite verbose because you may have to write a whole lot of different ones for all the different cases. So you know, with all these anonymous inner classes in your tests or whatever, just to do these sorts of things. Then of course there's mock objects, which for example EasyMock or JMock. And with those ones you basically you set up the expectations before you call the method under test. So for example, if you have a controller that calls through the service, with EasyMock you'd say something like, what do you say? Expect
the method call.
Expect the method call to return this. And then when you make the call, it will automatically return that value and your controller will use it in the right way. But with mock objects, you define the expectations and then you set the mocks into replay mode. Then you call the method, then you call verify, which checks all of those interactions happened, and then you can do any other assertions. Now, Mockito is something called a test spy, which is like mock objects, but instead of having to do that replay verify type thing, you just define the interactions you're concerned with up front. So you say, when this call gets made on this service, then return this value, which is similar. But for things where maybe it's a void return type, so you're just checking that it made the call, you can just verify them after the fact on its own. So you don't have to set all the mocks into a replay state, call the method and then verify. So it cuts out a lot of the clutter in your test and makes it a lot easier to read. Okay, so I'll show you an example. Oops, that's down. Okay, so in my examples that I'm doing here, basically I've just got an item, which is just a POJO. There's an item controller, which is going to do some really basic operations with the item. An item service, which the controller is going to be delegating to, and just an exception to show you how Mockito can mock exceptions. All this stuff is kind of done in a Spring 2.5 MVC approach, but I've omitted some of the things that aren't important, but it makes it quite simple. So I'm a big test-driven development fan, so up front we've got the test here, and this is what a Mockito test would look like. So basically what I'm trying to do is I've got a controller method which says view item. So you can imagine someone's going to your website and they need to view that particular item. They click the method, it goes to here, and this handles it. So the first two lines there, the first one's obviously creating the item, the next one is the Mockito line. And so what it says is, when the item service gets a call to get item with this ID, then it's going to return the item. We then call the item controller view item. This is just the method signature for the actual item controller, so it takes an ID and the Spring convention of passing in the model map. And then afterwards I can just check that the item is correctly in the model map, so that's the map that's used when it renders the view, and I can check that it's returning the right view. So what happens here is that this first line where it defines this behavior, it sets it up so that basically it acts as a test stub that would have returned just one particular value. So if you call this with any other ID apart from the item ID specified in the when statement, it'll just return none. So it's not going to fail, it's not going to blow up like EasyMock would, where it says, hey, you've made some interaction that wasn't specified in the expectations. It will just return null, and then of course my test will fail because assert equals item will be null from the model map, and it will fail. So that's a basic way to try and get some stubbing type techniques done for testing. Of course, when you implement the view item method, as the item controller would have said, this view item method doesn't exist. You hit control 1 in Eclipse, it creates the method for you. And of course it fails, which is cool. And then of course you just implement it. So the code here is pretty simple. It just calls the item service, which will then actually just delegate to the Mockito item service that we set up. And then puts the item that it received into the model map and returns the view. And so that will then make the test pass.
Where did item service come from?
Item service is it's a member variable of the controller class, so it was dependency injected, but it could have come from anywhere. So basically, the constructor for the item controller takes in the service that it needs to work with. Yeah. Yeah, so dependency injection is really one of the key things to be able to write nice, simple, testable code, and to be able to get a hold of the services that the controller needs to interact with. You can imagine if you have a whole lot of just singleton things looking up stuff, so in other words, the controller's going out and fetching the things it needs, it's really hard to try and test it because you're not giving it all of the objects it's going to interact with. Whereas if you set it up in a dependency injection style, where the controller takes in the service, then in your test you can just say, create new item controller, given the item service. And that's the item service that you mocked. I'll show you the full code for the test, which shows you how to set up the things. It's pretty simple.
I might have a dumb question if you just pop back one slide.
That one?
Yeah, that slide.
Yep.
Your goal is to test the service or the controller?
The controller.
Yeah, the thing that I think I've realised we don't know here is that the controller basically delegates everything up to the service, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's a skinny controller.
Right, so you need to know the internal representation of item controller to actually set up this test.
You need to know what it's going to collaborate with. Yeah. So we don't want the actual, we don't want the controller going out and finding some instance.
But we're testing the actual implementation of item controller, so...
Yeah, we're testing the item controller.
We have to
in this case, it's really stupid controller. It only does one thing.
And item service has to be
It's an interface.
non-private.
For sure, yeah. This is an item service, which could be used by your item controller, could also be used by maybe your home controller, shows a few items.
But what we're knowing when we write this test is we know that item service is a non-private member of item controller.
No, it's a private member.
Okay.
No one should be able to go, give me the item controller and get its service. So the item,
Okay.
this is dependency injection is what we're talking about. So yeah, it's a private member variable, and when you instantiate the controller, you give it the service that it needs to talk to.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
Is item service a mock?
Yes.
Or the
Item service is the mock object we've
how
created.
does it create it?
That's what
I'll
I'm
show
saying.
you.
Where does it actually
Yeah.
Let me jump forward.
So it looks like it's just there, so we...
Yep. Okay, so this is what you need to do to set it up to run. It's pretty simple. The main things are we need to put run with Mockito JUnit runner, and all that does is it basically looks for any member variables that have an annotation of mock on them and instantiates them with Mockito. So it instantiates an instance of item service that is a mock object. And then you can see down the bottom here, this is where we're instantiating the controller with the item service using this sort of dependency injection style. So does that make a bit more sense? Or?
Yeah, it does, except the item service is not hidden from us in our test. But
Oh no, because we've instantiated the service and given it to the controller.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I understand, but in that sense, what are we testing? Carry on.
I guess we're assuming that the service works, and we're
Yeah.
testing the controller.
Yeah, we're running unit
Yeah, and
tests.
you're assuming that your internal implementation of item controller uses that
But
service.
that's exactly what you're testing. So
Yeah.
you're testing the internal
Yeah.
implementation.
You're using your service as a convenience because you know that maybe it acts as a database and you don't have one available, so you're just making something that's just going to do what it needs to do so that you can actually test the controller code that you're interested in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if item controller wasn't using the item service that we've instantiated at the top here, when we call when,
Yep.
then it wouldn't have given us that same item back until the test would have failed.
Yep.
So we know that it's using the item service we've instantiated it with.
Yep.
Maybe I should start off with dependency injection stuff.
No, I'm familiar with that.
Very familiar with that.
Okay.